Hi, good evening, everyone. And yeah, it's been a long 3 days and long evenings. But I think we are nearing the end of our 3 day sci-fi. This is the penultimate panel looking at space exploration, but looking at a different aspect, looking at how public and private partnership can step up the competitiveness, make space exploration a lot more fun, a lot cheaper, a lot more cost effective. So that's a plan for the evening. And I think this topic comes at a very important time because I think there have been several important changes that have been taking place in the last close to 2 decades now. Even early 2000s, I think the space was primarily run by state agencies. The private sector participation was fairly limited, more in terms of, if you look at the case of Asia, for instance, it was more in terms of supplying certain components, certain systems, and so on and so forth, but not as a private sector as a key stakeholder, as an independent stakeholder. This may have been slightly different when you look at the case of the Western countries. Western countries have had a larger private sector participation for far longer. But non-Western context, the private sector participation has always been fairly limited. They have engaged the private sector, like I said, in a very limited, specific case by case kind of approach in a sense. But I think that is changing. That is changing for a number of reasons. One, I think there is a lot of excitement with new private players like the SpaceX, Blue Origin, Nanoracks, Virgin Galactic, all of these companies entering the space exploration, engaging in a various number of activities. I think that there is a lot of excitement among a larger private sector community, not just belonging to the West, but even across Asia and other developing parts of the world. So I think there is a greater opportunity for the private sector to play a greater role, a bigger role in, and I think this is also when you look at the case of Asia, Asia had remained by and large completely owned by state agencies driving the space programs. But I think the things like, for instance, China's embrace of the private sector has changed enormously over the last few years. There's more than 100 new startups and small and medium-sized enterprises that have been functioning out there. Japan has been somewhat of a more pro when it comes to industry engagement. India had remained somewhat skeptical because ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, which is the state space agency, the civil space agency organization, it has been enjoying a certain amount of monopoly, and it hasn't felt the need to engage the private sector in an active manner. But I think that is changing because the growing set of demands on space-based services have become the driver in a sense. The space is no more limited to just civil space agents, civil space functions, whether it is in terms of telemedicine or teleeducation or weather forecasting. But there are growing set of demands, other demands, security set of demands. So growing demands, but I think the ISRO's ability, let me to give you an example, the ISRO's ability to keep up with the growing demands is limited. So in a sense, the capacity deficit is what is driving, at least in the Indian case, to explore what can be done in order to what can be done by engaging the private sector. To that extent, last 2 years, the political leadership in the country, both Prime Minister Modi as well as the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, have made a lot of big statements about engaging the private sector to use the ISRO facilities and so on and so forth. Just a couple of weeks ago, a week ago actually, Prime Minister launched the DIF Space initiative, which is where the private sector is going to be given an opportunity to engage in India's defense space sector. This is for the first time that we are happening, because private sector has always been looked at with some amount of suspicion that they are going to be driven by profit motive and that they may not be the best agency to work on sensitive strategic issues and so on and so forth. But I think with this launch of the DEF Space initiative, you are seeing the changes even in the defense space sector. So I think it's a great moment to look at how private sector can contribute to stepping up the competitiveness of many countries, many of their own space programs. And in this regard, I think both Japan, in the case of Japan and India in particular, are looking at two factors are driving their space engagements. One is the security-based needs. Second is capturing a sizable chunk of the global commercial space market. In both of these cases, unless the space competitiveness is strengthened, you'll be on a losing game. There are newer players who are entering the market who will capture that market in a sense. So I think that's, with that as a background, let me just move to looking at, I think we have a terrific panel to look at a gamut of all of these various aspects of these issues. How do you look at public-private partnership? Bringing in the private sector as a key stakeholder, how do you engage them? What are the kind of regulatory measures that are required to make these statements, make the announcements a reality on the ground? So lots of changes. Really good time to look at some of these issues. I have 4 panelists here with me. Aya Iwamoto, Director of the Japan Space Policy with Astroscale Japan, and she's based in Japan. Ashok Jivi, who's the Dispute Resolution Council Factum Law based in Bangalore. Ross Crusher from Policy Fellow with the Center for Global Development in the United States, and George Weinman, Senior Director, Orbital Reef Enterprise Development of the Blue Origin, United States. So let me start off with some of the questions. If we can start off with some good examples, what are the kind of key examples that you look at that can promote the importance, that can come out of that can highlight the importance of public-private partnership, and that can further the space development, step up the overall competitiveness of the space programs? Maybe I'll start off with you, Aya, if that's okay. Okay, let me start with George then. Okay, you're right here.
Sure, so Blue Origin is, of course, very focused on human spaceflight. Everybody's probably familiar with our suborbital rocket, New Shepard, which is launched 6 times with humans since our inaugural launch last year. Our founder went to space and came back. It was very passionately motivated by that experience. And so we were going to focus a little bit on the human spaceflight aspect of public-private partnerships. When NASA stopped flying the space shuttle at the end of the 2010s, there was a gap in our capability in the United States, and they made a very conscious choice, and it was a controversial choice at the time, to continue forward with commercial crew and commercial cargo missions to the International Space Station. And that was a fairly radical change for NASA, to contract out the entire mission, soup to nuts, to completely private parties, who then competed for those contracts and then performed them. And it's turned out to be very, very successful. So much so that as the International Space Station is now coming to its retirement at the end of this decade, that NASA has chosen to replace the International Space Station with commercial LEO destinations, is what they call the program, but essentially a commercial space station rather than a government space station. And I think that shows the power of this type of arrangement where NASA considers itself a user, a customer, rather than purely a developer. That being said, none of these things would have happened without NASA having stepped up and provided the core technology, the guidance, the direction that was necessary as a leading customer to make those projects very successful. And so I think that learning how to be a space agency that works with the commercial sector, it's not simply writing an RFP or a contract. It's also having technical interchange meetings. It's having other good requirements definitions. It's also giving a little bit of freedom for the commercial entities to figure out their own way to go forward. And then new ideas and new capabilities come out of that. And it moves on a much faster schedule than what they're used to, which is also a little scary for them at times.
Talk a little bit, you did say that you have a lot of technology exchange meetings and so on and so forth, but what are the kind of policy and regulatory issues that you may have encountered even when NASA is fully on board with regard to engaging the private sector?
Sure. Well, one of the big things about being a state agency is that the other state agencies tend to let you write your own rules. So when NASA was flying their own astronauts to space on the space shuttle, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and other organizations really kind of let them do it the way they wanted to do it. And now when we're moving into a more commercial sector, well, commercial companies have to comply with all state agencies, not only the one that's the customer. And so as we look at things like a commercial space station, we have to think about radiation effects. Are we following OSHA, the Occupational Safety Administration, or are we only following what NASA says as a regulation? So it changes the game a little bit. And then I think when you look at going internationally, now you need to start thinking, how does a commercial company engage with not only their home country, but how do they work and comply and entice other countries to get involved, because there's no longer an intergovernmental agreement between the home agency and the other agencies around the world.
And take some of the same kind of experience, Rose. What can you talk about the kind of experiences that you have seen in terms of how the environment has changed, where there's a greater requirement being felt for the need to kind of engage the private sector in an active fashion. Things have been easier on the US side, but even then, there may have been some difficulties, or if you can share some thoughts and experience on that front.
I'm delighted to do so. But I think an interesting change has been a shift even in state space agencies where they've picked up some of this new space ethos, where they're more willing to accept some risk, willing to work with the private sector, and also recognize that space agencies' responsibility is not just launching satellites or establishing launch facilities. It's really nurturing the entire ecosystem. So making sure that academia is providing the human capital that's needed, that private sector is prepared to engage, profit, and be an active player, as we've just been talking about. The government itself has its own role, and then civil society has a clear role. And then government's responsibility really is driving the connections between these organizations toward an end state that is not necessarily space-oriented. We're not trying to do space for space's sake, but to address national priorities, things like sustainable development goals. That's the end piece. Space is one tool of multiple possibilities to arrive at that end state. Talking about old space versus new space, old space was kind of focused on that primary customer that was the government in the US prior to the shift from the space shuttle, or during the phase, kind of the old space phase, where the primary goal was to provide services to a government. New space is really got a global customer base. They're interested in diversifying who they're providing that service to, which is also an opportunity for greater inclusiveness, which I think is really a good push toward sustainability, toward peace in space, because the more countries that are involved, the more people that have a say in the design of what we're doing in space, the better chance we can keep it a peaceful environment. So I guess that's my initial take. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You want to add something?
I just want to mention that peacefulness in space part is something that's really come home to me recently, since I've been more involved with Blue Origin's human spaceflight program. There was a NSA anti-satellite test not too long ago, and it caused the International Space Station to have to relocate. And it was front page news all over the world. Right. If there had not been humans in space that had to get out of the way of that debris, would it have been front page news? Would there have been the peer pressure effect that resulted from that? And so I actually think that human spaceflight is actually a very powerful force for peace and promoting cooperation in a different way than we might have expected.
Yeah, sure. Aya, let me come to you to give us a sense of Japan has been different. Japan is part of the one of the Asian established players. Japan's experience in engaging the private sector has been somewhat different from China and India, who are the other established space players in this part of the world. How has it been, in a sense, what are the kind of changes that you have seen over the years? Now, companies like, industries like, industry houses like Astroscale has come up and so on and so forth. What are the kind of changes that you see? And you can share your own thoughts about both the Japan experience, but also Astroscale, if you want to talk about.
Thank you, Raji. And my name is Aya from Astroscale Japan. My company, Astroscale, is the so-called on-orbit servicing company trying to solve solutions for space sustainability by providing solutions such as active debris removal or life extension, providing servicing on the orbit. So, and as for the question by Raji, I think Japan is also trying to figure out a new approach of partnership and collaboration between private and public sector. And as George said, we understand that NASA's intentional decision to form a new partnership is influencing Japan as well. And on orbit servicing specifically, there's a project called CRD2, Commercial Removal of Debris Demonstration Project by JAXA, Space Agency. And this project aims to be the first of its kind for technology demonstration of removing large-scale space debris. And project is launched collaboration with the private sector, so that in the future that space debris removal can be commercialized. And my company, Astroscale, is selected as a partner for the phase 1. And this is actually the first of its kind in Japan of the service procurement in that sense. And we are in the middle, we are planning to launch the Address J satellite for this project in next year. And what we learned through this partnership with JAXA is, well, JAXA used to define technology requirement for their specific project, and the commercial company get contract with JAXA and basically follows that technology requirement. But for this CRD2, JAXA for the first time did not define technology requirement. Instead, they guarantee the safety review. So from our perspective, we can learn a lot in terms of safety from the expertise and experience of JAXA, Space Agency, and also JAXA can utilize our innovation. As George mentioned earlier, that we can actually provide services in faster and more flexible way. So I think it's happening now, and I hope it will proliferate to the other sectors like launching or other satellite operations. And also, I would like also to introduce some of the other region like ESA and Europe also are supporting various on-orbit servicing project, a similar kind. And our Astroscale UK is collaborating with the ESA on the ELSA-M project, a similar kind of removing defunct satellite from the LEO. So it is happening, and we are seeing the result.
Thank you. So let me just come to the Indian experience. So there are, of course, several benefits from private sector engagement. One, I think the private sector entry has made access to space a lot cheaper because it's been a very cost-effective one. They bring in a lot of energy. They bring in talent. They bring in mostly you can avoid much of the red tape and delays that you see when you normally encounter when you deal with state agencies and their bureaucracies. There are also a lot of innovation and cost effectiveness. Yet India has been somewhat hesitant in embracing the private sector and give them a sort of a freewheeling space in a sense to act as an independent stakeholder. We have engaged the private sector. Some of the established ones like the Lockheed, I'm saying L&T, Larsen & Toubro, or the Godrej, and so on and so forth. But those are, again, very need-based in a sense. So why has ISRO been somewhat skeptical of this? This is changing, of course. India has come out with, ISRO has a Department of Space now, has come out with a series of institutions, In Space, New Space India Limited, and ISPA. All of these are meant to encourage larger private sector participation. But even then, ISRO it feels like they are not entirely. In fact, the Deaf Space Agency initiative, when it was launched, I think Prime Minister made the point that ISRO should be more of an enabler than a gatekeeper role, which it had kind of sort of played for a very long time. So how do you look at the changes that are slowly happening, and what are the kind of hurdles, both in terms of the legal, regulatory challenges that private sector, new space, or small and medium-sized enterprises have had to face in India? Ashok, okay.
Okay, so see the Indian experience. I think more than knowing what we should do, now we know what we should not do. There is a good amount of case studies in terms of public-private partnerships, both working and not working. I think where it really worked for ISRO was probably in the vendor engagement model, where ISRO had ownership over design, IP, and specific vendors were being roped in for undertaking very specific parts of the overall mission, as opposed to actually owning the IP themselves. And I think what the recent spate of reforms did is now there's a big push for the private sector enterprise to actually take a more proactive role and not just get confined to the vendor ecosystem. And I think the areas where we really found some, the principal reason why I think there was always this hesitance was because it's not ISRO's prerogative alone to enter into these engagements. So for example, if we take a look at a simple case study of spectrum assignment and frequency allocation, DOS might take a stand or may make a decision saying that this project is okay to approve in terms of frequency allocation. But the Department of Telecommunication may come back and say that, look, this particular frequency and spectrum is not available for being assigned to the private sector, so we don't agree with your decision. Similarly, a certain price point could have been agreed by officials of, say, Antrix Corporation, but the Comptroller and Auditor General can come back and say that you have underquoted, and therefore we do not, we feel that there is something here to investigate. And what that does, it creates a lot of insecurity for decision makers within the bureaucracy, and they have to constantly ask themselves this question that if I take a decision, which I do so with the utmost bona fides in mind, will tomorrow the policy support me if there are any investigations or whether there are any inquiries? And I think the one problem statement that has consistently affected decision makers in this regard is you don't have a policy framework in the back end for public-private partnership that you can measure decisions against. So tomorrow, if a particular decision taken by ISRO or Antrix has to be examined to determine whether it's completely bona fide, whether it's lawful, whether it actually complies with all legal requirements, the best way to do that is to actually go back to the back-end policy and see if it's consistent or not. But currently, that policy framework itself was quite ambiguous. And this, in turn, led to a lot of unwarranted investigations, a lot of litigations and inquiries that could have otherwise been completely avoided. So I think one big thing that we will have to look at in terms of creating this enabling framework from a policy perspective is to ensure that law becomes very clear and gives the framework for decision makers to know what exactly they can and cannot do, and what are the parameters based on which they can take their decisions, and essentially what are the 10 things that if they do correctly, tomorrow no questions will be asked and the decisions will not be called for unnecessary review and re-examination. And I think that's where the hesitance really came from.
Hopefully we are in for a bigger changes in the coming years, but I think despite the statements, we still need to see the regulatory framework emerging. Only then the private sector will also feel confident to kind of engage, put in their money or things of that kind in a sense. Let me come to some of the larger questions in terms of all of us are also looking for partnerships and so on and so forth, building collaborative, because space is still an expensive domain to engage in, despite the fact that there has been cost effectiveness brought in by the private sector entry. But I think still, if you're looking at some of the complex mission, it also requires a lot of resources. So this has also led to a certain amount of collaborations, partnerships across the board. But at the same time, you also need to incentivize partners to come in, private sector from a global private industry, if they have to come to Japan or if they have to come to India. What are those kind of measures that you can take in order to create a level playing field for the private players and create a better space ecosystem so that enables space exploration in the truest sense? So, George, can I start with you?
That's putting me on the spot. I don't know, are you in a better position to answer this one? Give me some time.
Happy to step into this realm. So actually, I really, in my research, I focus on really newly emerging space actors and the problem of having very limited resources or really competing for resources amongst many worthy causes is a real and valid problem. But I would say space development and development can go hand in hand. And part of that is thanks to the new space environment, where you don't have to build an entire satellite capability yourself. You can use space as a service. So when I think about a new space program, I like to emphasize foundational space capabilities that really maximize the access to, use of, and full localization of space technology for relevant problem sets. So that can cover quite a spectrum of activity. But if I were to say, look at Earth observation data, remote sensing data, it really matters that a country has their own researchers who are building algorithms that are focused on local problems. So if you're buying material or solutions that are designed for soybean crops in Ohio, it's maybe not optimized for mixed crops and small plots in Senegal. So you need that internal capacity to encourage that capacity in your academic section. through government programs to be able to understand what data makes the most sense and then facilitate acquiring that kind of data before you start talking about launching your own Earth observation satellite, which is extremely expensive. Maybe and ideally, at a point down the line, you've exhausted available imagery. It's not frequent enough. It's not focused on your problems. It's not looking at the right spectrum. Well, then you start investing in that upstream hardware to develop maybe sensors that are optimized for what you need. Maybe you put together a satellite cooperative with another country to cut costs. Or maybe because of security issues and you want to have certainty that it's going to belong to you always, you invest in doing that launch yourself. But it's a progressive, deliberate action. It's not space just for space's sake.
Had a chance to collect those thoughts. That was a great answer, but I think I can add another dimension to it. I think you were getting to the crux of how do you convince people that we really mean it. And so I think it's a marketing problem. Somebody asked me the other day, why is it that the rest of the world maybe doesn't understand the full range of capabilities that India really has to offer right now? And my answer was, you need to sell the sizzle. There's a lot going on here, but it's not as widely known as they might think it should be. And I think we're making some great steps towards that. The launch of the OneWeb satellites, which was done in record time. I mean, I think that for any country to take that launch order and get it to the pad and launch it successfully on that complex of a rocket system is fantastic. That will be noticed. But on top of that, I think that the intergovernmental relationships also matter because there are a few marquee projects that are going on now that maybe don't get as much attention as they deserve between the United States and India. And India has similar projects with Europe and other countries that sort of show that the nation's leaders of these different countries are serious about cooperating in certain technology areas that perhaps were previously perceived as being very sensitive. And when business leaders see that, they get more comfortable that they're going to be operating in an environment. Their government has already taken the risk to show that the cooperation is okay in this area, and they're not going to be cut off at the knees, 5 years down the line. And I think that this security environment that we're now, increasingly moving into plays a significant factor in some of those considerations. We wouldn't be in India talking about a commercial space station and how India could participate in orbital reef, which is one of the big projects that I'm leading, if we didn't feel comfortable that the security relationship between India and the United States was going to be fruitful and a supportive environment going forward.
No, that's a terrific point, because I think one of the game changer moments was when India and the US signed the India-US nuclear agreement. And I think that was the moment when I think both countries decided that India and the US, there was even a talk about the litmus test of the relationship would be in how the two countries are able to trade in strategic goods and services. So since then, we have expanded the number of areas, critical and emerging technology areas that we work on. Aya, do you want to sort of talk about as to how, again, you look at Japan and India have a lot of collaborative ventures and so on and so forth. What are the kind of things we are engaged in, and what do you see further going forward in a sense? Or even broader, we can talk about.
Yeah, I just want to just thought of one point about incentivizing foreign space players to one countries. And I just like to point out that there's always a conscious policy to do that. And I was thinking about UK example, like Astroscale is it's headquartered in Japan, but we have a global footprint in UK. And one of the reasons why we choose to have UK office is that UK has a policy that to inviting a global space sector and to grow its domestic space industry. So that includes having a clear mission requirements. As Ashok said, it's very important for space companies to have predictable and clear regulatory environment. And having thought of that, maybe Japan is still not, I haven't seen any discussion on sort of giving incentives to inviting foreign companies to Japan to grow the Japanese space industry as a whole. So at the end of the day, I think space is a global activity, so it kind of needs to have both way going and outside, inviting and also going outside. So there needs to be a clear policy decision and yeah, clear policy for that. So.
Ashok, I think we are also kind of looking to expand our partnerships. I think the security environment that we are in today, the major geopolitical trends that we see, the balance of power dynamics that play out, China's growth has been the most consequential and strategic one for India. So we are looking at new partnerships and kind of thing. What are some of the major trends that we see, and how can we sort of attract major partnerships, major partners to come to India, work with India? What can India do to attract or incentivize their participation in the Indian market?
So see, I think this question can be answered by reference to certain parallels from other sectors. So for example, one of the significant game changers post the 1990s was a change in the intellectual property protection regime in India. So we became compliant with the trade-related aspects of intellectual property, and the IP protection framework became much better. And that became a confidence-inspiring measure for investments to come into the country. The other example I can think of is the concept of offsets in defense procurements, where every contract, a percentage of that value had to be, for the lack of a better word, repatriated into spin-off technologies or spin-off businesses in the country, which was a huge enabling factor. So I think these are some models that we can look at, and I think the underlying answer is that if we learn to honor our obligations under bilateral investment treaties, under various other international trade and investment obligations that we have undertaken, I think that by itself is a big step in the right direction. And in this particular area, our journey, especially in telecommunications and space, has been slightly turbulent. So I think if we can get that compliance with the bilateral investment treaties right, that's the best way that we can attract foreign capital into the country. And then you can have concepts like offsets coming in to ensure that some of the newer emerging startups are able to benefit from the larger value contracts that are being doled out to the bigger enterprises. So I think that's one way to go about it.
I think we have about slightly more than 10 minutes. We can also take a few questions from the audience. And then, any questions? I think all of you have been so wonderfully clear, and clarity of thought has been. Okay, let me just take off from some of the partnership, the issue that we were talking about. The fact that we have the Quad in place, bringing together India, Australia, Japan, and the United States, or any number of other trilaterals, mini-lateral groupings are coming together. What is the kind of model, and how do you look at plugging in the private sector, plugging into those kind of smaller grouping engagements? I'll give you just an example, because several, I think more than a decade ago, there was the Indo-US STF, Indo-US Science and Technology Forum, where the model was looking at essentially private sector putting in a certain amount of money, and the state agency was also putting in, I think, equal or something similar amount of money. So thus you were able to get something going in a sense. And are there similar kind of models that you can look at? Are there similar, any kind of examples that you can think of? Maybe you have worked with other agencies, other state and private enterprises? Okay.
So I'm not going to be able to speak to historical examples very well, but I can speak to a current challenge that we're facing at this time. So I've mentioned a couple of times about Orbital Reef. So very briefly, Orbital Reef is this new commercial space station that's intended to replace the International Space Station at the end of the decade. Now, the International Space Station was governed by an intergovernmental agreement. So it was 5 major groups, US, Canada, Japan, Russia, and many countries in the European Union. And they got together and wrote this agreement that essentially was almost like a treaty and opened up a huge amount of cooperation, had waivers for liability, had waivers for ITAR and ERR issues in a number of areas. None of that exists for a commercial space station. And yet at the same time, NASA has given very clear direction that they want us commercial providers to have NASA be a large but not majority customer. They want to be a large tenant, but they don't want to be the only user. So you look around the market for users of space stations, and it's other civil agencies around the world, as well as a growing but still small portion of the commercial market, and then a growing consumer market, which would be mass media and tourism and things like that. So the question is, in a country like India, or any country, Japan, Canada, other places, state dollars like to be spent in the state of origin. So how does a commercial space station develop relationships in a country like India, where India can develop its investment in human spaceflight, but spend that money in India? And the challenge is that we're not building fighter jets or widgets, where there's lots of units and you can set up factory lines and have easy payback. So in this case, we're looking at how we can develop partnerships in India that replicate essentially what we're doing in the United States, where we're building our component and NASA is going to be our customer. Can we find partners in India who want to do the same thing? And we partner together to develop that, almost like a real estate project, because we're essentially building real estate in space. And in this case, the user or the customer that comes and occupies that real estate might be ISRO, might be other institutions in India. And so the question then becomes, do we set up something of our own here, or do we set up partnerships with existing industrial parties, or even real estate companies, or even Bollywood, to develop capabilities where they own and operate that aspect of orbital reef for India, from India, and we all benefit from that, becoming essentially a global community in space. And I think it's a very interesting, new and novel approach to how we're going to work together, because orbital reef doesn't stay over India, it doesn't stay over the United States, it's orbiting the whole Earth all the time. And so how do we create these new business models that allow us to have that state participation, but while there's money flowing back into the state itself?
Okay. I think this model, space as a service, is adding a huge amount of flexibility, is adding new options to a country that otherwise would not have been able to launch a space station. So that's a phenomenal kind of new era thing. But I do come back to what I see as the role of a space agency, the role of the government in encouraging the space ecosystem or the space sector, and that they need to be as holistic as possible. So are we growing, the human capital it takes to have parity at the table with, any private sector company coming from anywhere, to have a fair conversation about what is a reasonable arrangement going forward? So that's an important, foundational capability. And also, I'd say, keeping in mind that, you have an end goal. You're trying to build something specific, and maybe this is or is not, a tool that's useful to get there. So you have to have this program mindset where you're saying, okay, what activities are we doing? What outputs does that have? Is it has the desired outcome we want? The actual effect. If you build a road, maybe the output is the miles of road you laid down. The outcome is that you fostered economy. You foster people being able to get to the market on time, even in bad weather. So that's the difference. And how are we measuring, the outcomes from this kind of arrangement? So I think this is a really interesting time. I think governments are taking on more of a new space attitude in the sense of accepting some risk, iterating cooperation and types of programs, which is very healthy. It's important to monitor that and say, okay, are we achieving our objectives? And if not, we can change that. You are not set in concrete with a particular path. And I think governments in particular have a hard time with that kind of mentality. But I'm optimistic that it's moving in that direction. And that a willingness to adapt, I guess the iteration and adapt piece is really, really critical on a cyclical sort of schedule.
Thanks, Rose. Any questions from the audience? Yeah, Mark.
Hi, I have a question for Mr. Ashok JV. You were talking about the bureaucracy and space. I was working on my PhD on India's space program, and I talked to many players regarding the scope of the privatization of the Indian space program, so on and so forth. So many of the academicians and scholars, and even research scholars, they were of the opinion that many people in India still see the industry as the enemy. The businessmen, the business interests, they have the pride factor which comes from the ISRO. But the similar pride factor does not generate from a business class. How does the industry sees this kind of problem? Because bureaucracy works on the part of the people. So if there are certain stakeholders which, let's say, are telling ISRO or the government or the Department of Space that it's better off that you become the gatekeeper that you are and keep on, leading on that role and do not substantially change anything. So how do you answer this thing? And I have a second question also. Yeah. How do you see outer space treaty right now? Is it still active, defunct? Does the treaty which came in 1967, what relevance it has in 2022? Thank you.
Sorry? Okay. No, if you had a question, we'll take this round together.
This is Farzana from South Asian University. I am working on also outer space, but my perspective, I'm working on a small country's perspective, but I'm not going to ask the question regarding that. So my question to George, you know that this is the age of commercialization. We call it the space commercialization age. So there are a lot of actors that is not in the past 2 decades or like last 50 years. So recently, we can see there are a lot of hot argument with SpaceX about the about the satellite support in Ukraine war. So I can see the temperature and the tension between the state actor and non-state actor there. So, and recently in a narrative coming from the military Chinese narrative that says that they are considering a private actor like SpaceX growing in the outer space as a threat to their security. So do you think that in future there will be any place for small countries to survive in between the state and non-state these actors? And how's yours? How do you think that the private companies will face more security issues, involving or evolving with this, fighting with these major powers in the space? Thank you.
Thank you. So, Ashok, do you want to start off?
The question regarding seeing the private sector as an enemy, I think what 2020 and beyond seems to suggest is that we are now seeing the private sector as a key element of technology self-reliance, because defense imports has complicated our foreign policy stance. Even in the recent Russia-Ukraine conflict, that was very clear. And I would presume that we now understand that if we have to take a conscious, independent foreign policy stance, self-reliance is very important. So I don't think that mentality of looking at the private sector as an enemy continues anymore. That being said, I think we also have to acknowledge that ISRO has a certain track record and a certain credibility and a certain leadership position in this sector. And it's important that we engage with ISRO because a lot of critical mentorship, access to facilities, key elements of a successful private space economy still comes from ISRO. So I think it's important that we acknowledge the role of ISRO as a thought leader, as an enabler. And I think from ISRO's point of view, there has been a huge outreach to the private sector in the recent past. So I think the old mentality of looking at it as almost an adversarial relationship does not exist anymore, number one. Coming to the Outer Space Treaty, I think the Outer Space Treaty will always be the foundation on which every other rulemaking or activity in space will come out of. But that being said, the Outer Space Treaty also came in an era when commercial space was not as prevalent. It still emerged in a very Cold War kind of a setting. So that being said, I think there's a lot of gaps that we can fill up. For example, Artemis Accord, to my mind, is an effort to fill in those gaps. So I think it will continue to be the Magna Carta, but a lot has to be built on top of that, and I think that will be the challenge for international jurists everywhere.
Sure. So I'm going to add to that comment, and then I'll address the second question. I think that from what I've seen engaging over the past 3 or 4 months, I do not see this tension of historical parts of the Indian space establishment looking at startups as a threat. If anything, there's a huge embracement of bring your ideas, bring anything you can come. And I think there's going to be a bit of a shaking out as people begin to realize again that space is in fact quite hard. And that it requires strong capital, strong industrial capabilities, as well as startup energies and other things. It's not as easy as just the way the IT sector is. But that being said, I think that there's a lot of energy there and they'll be very supportive. To your question about small companies or countries having access in the future to space and whether or not security threats and other factors are a concern, I guess I would say it this way. First of all, as we move into a more commercial era of space, just like every other industry, different countries are going to develop different comparative advantages. And depending on when different countries start engaging more actively in space development, they may develop different advantages or different strengths and capabilities. And I think that's just like every other industry. We shouldn't treat space as being unique in that respect. I think that the Outer Space Treaty is very much still in effect. I think that there are going to need to be interpretations of how that treaty rolls out and is affected, because commerce does need to exist in space. And I guess I would say that security threats are like anything else. If shipping companies aren't immune to the effects of war, airliners has been demonstrated recently, are sometimes caught in the middle of shooting games. I think that space will be, in some ways, just like, again, every other industry. That domain is unique, it's special because it is the high ground, but space commerce will face the same threats that every other form of commerce on Earth faces in conflicts. But that being said, the more commerce there is, the more peaceful things tend to be. And so I think that space commerce, or commerce even within the cislunar future economy, and commerce within low Earth orbit, and more interconnectivity is a huge driving force for peace. And I may give my example earlier of humans in space make it a real front page news thing when there are threats that otherwise might be taken as page 6. And a last comment, I know we're over time, is that space is big. It is so big. Remember, we're talking about the circumference of the Earth, where we have 8 billion people right now. And now you're expanding that another couple hundred kilometers, and then another couple thousand kilometers after that, and eventually to tens of thousands of kilometers above that. The total area we have to work with in space is ginormous. It is bigger than you can possibly imagine, especially when you start considering going out to the moon and eventually even beyond. So I think that if the question is that somebody's going to feel that they're late to the game, this is a tortoise and the hare kind of a situation. Don't worry, there is a lot of room out there and a lot of new creative business models. Not all of them are going to be defined by sensors and technology and hardware. Some of them are going to be defined by culture, by humanity, and other aspects that make our overall global economy so successful.
Thank you, George. And I think, okay, Ross, very quickly.
I think I would just expand on that. Not only the physical space, but the cyberspace.
Yeah.
So the space ecosystem and the data ecosystem really overlap, particularly if you're thinking about Earth-focused capabilities. So position, navigation, and timing data is baked into all types of infrastructure, financial, transportation, name it. There's probably some use of GPS or like system. Earth observation data is so common. Many people have no idea where that data is coming from. If anyone uses your weather app, it's for sure using Earth observation data. And of course, the satellite broadband or the space segment of telecommunications is default in every country's telecommunications infrastructure. But some really exciting changes where you have these new constellations, these low Earth orbit or like non-geospatial orbit satellites that are lowering the cost of internet in the most remote locations and manageable. And so this is going to provide like tangible benefits to those several billion people still on planet Earth. So basically I also agree the boundary is not defined. It's constantly expanding as we figure out kind of new approaches or new uses for these space-based capabilities.
And not to trivialize space traffic management and the issues of deconflicting the use of space, that just like every other human endeavor, we're going to have to get together and kind of figure out how to work together. But there's lots of room, and we have lots of technology yet to invent that will help us solve these problems.
Which was precisely the theme of our last night dinner panel, in a sense, space traffic management. But I think there's a lot of excitement about commercial engagement, bringing in private sector, who bring in a lot of innovation, a lot of new technologies, make it cost effective. On that positive note, I'm going to thank all the 4 panelists, Aya, Ashok, Rose, and George. Thank you so much. And a hand of applause to everybody here. Thank you.